Good afternoon. I'm Ann Killebrew, an associate professor at the Pennsylvania State University and president of our local Archaeological Institute of America chapter. Together with Chuck Jones, the Tom Burroughs Librarian of the Classics and Humanities and vice president of the Central Pennsylvania local AIA chapter, we warmly welcome you to our Sunday afternoon lecture by Professor Umar Harmanshah. His lecture on the archaeology of Anatolian landscapes is co-sponsored by the Archaeological Institute of America, our local AIA Central Pennsylvania chapter, Penn State's Department of Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies, and the College of Liberal Arts at the Pennsylvania State University. I also take this opportunity to thank Mark Kepler, our Penn State IT consultant, for kindly agreeing to provide technological assistance for our webinar on this Sunday afternoon. Chuck Jones will be moderating the question session after the lecture. I encourage all of you to submit your questions to him during the course of the lecture via the Q&A option on Zoom. And he will be addressing the questions after the lecture. I'm delighted to see such a wonderful turnout from all over the world. I'm especially pleased to introduce our speaker today, Umar Harmanshah, an associate professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Professor Harmanshah is a leading scholar in the history of landscapes in the Middle East who specializes in the art, architecture, material culture of Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia during the Bronze and Iron Ages. He has devoted much of his research to the politics of ecology, place, and heritage. He's the author of two monographs, Cities and the Shaping of Memory in the Ancient Near East, published by Cambridge University Press in 2013, and Place, Memory, and Healing, an Archaeology of Anatolian Rock Monuments, published by Routledge in 2015. He's also the editor of a volume entitled Of Rocks and Water Towards an Archaeology of Place, published by Oxford Books in 2014. Currently, Professor Harmanshah is working on a new monograph on landscape history and political ecology in the Middle East, which addresses the challenges of climate change and environmental crisis on landscape archaeology and archaeological field practice. He is the principal investigator for the 3-year multi-institutional collaborative project entitled Political Ecology as Practice, a Regional Approach to the Anthropocene. This project is supported by the Humanities Without Walls Consortium, which is funded by a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Since 2001, Professor Harmanshah has been directing the Albert Yaldase Archaeological Landscape Project, a diachronic regional survey project addressing questions of place and landscape on the Konya province of West Central Turkey. Today, Professor Harmanshah will be speaking on the archaeology of Anatolian landscapes, politics of water and ecology on the Hittite borderlines. Now, without further ado, I warmly welcome Professor Harmanshah and turn over the webinar to him. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Anne, for that really wonderful, generous, and warm introduction. I'm really delighted to speak for the AIA's Central Pennsylvania chapter, and hello everyone from and greetings from Evanston, Illinois. Thank you so much for joining us from all over the world and sort of spending your precious hour on this kind of beautiful spring day. There's sunshine here in Evanston, and I'll do my best so that you won't regret your decision. I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. So hopefully it's visible to everyone. So please let me know if there's any problems. I'm very grateful to the Central Pennsylvania chapter of the AIA, especially Ann Killebrew, for inviting me to present today, my work to you today. Special thanks to Mark Kepler for helping us setting up this webinar. Also Chuck Jones, who will be fielding the questions. I'm really looking forward to that conversation following my presentation, and I will welcome your questions and and thoughts and suggestions. And I've recently been elected to the governing board of the AIA as an academic trustee, and I'm really very honored by this position. And I can't emphasize how important this professional organization is for cultural heritage, for the protection of cultural heritage around the world, for setting up ethical codes of conduct in archaeological practice, for the maintenance of the image of archaeology as science among the public, and really connecting the public to archaeological practice. It's the work that is done by this organization is enormous and incredible. So I'm very honored to be part of this. I'm greeting you with this image of photograph of the Bulasan River, seen from the Hittite fortress of Kale Tepesi near the modern town of Ilgan. And you can make out the ashlar blocks of the impressive Hittite masonry in the foreground, and the Albert Project team members work collecting shards on a beautiful and clear day in July of 2011. Quick correction, our project started not in 2001, but in 2010. We've been closing on 10 years, more than 10 years now. And 2011 was our second season in the field. What I'd like to present to you today is some of the not so preliminary at this point. I always say preliminary, but it's not so preliminary anymore. Results of our landscape archaeology project in West Central Turkey, as Anne mentioned, Yalburt Yaylası Archaeological Landscape Research Project, an archaeological survey and landscape history project that I have been directing in collaboration with Dr. Perry Johnson since 2010. And I'd like to encourage you to visit our project website, yalbertproject.org, to explore some of the landscapes that we've been working on, and download our publications and reports and get news updates. This is a diachronic settlement history project, meaning that we document and care for all historical periods, although we have been focusing our intellectual energies, especially on the politics of ecology and water at the time of the Hittite Empire. So when this important region, southern borderland region, this is an area that is actually a borderland for the Hittites, kind of a buffer zone with the Mediterranean coastline, particularly Lukaland and Taruntaja that you see on the map. Today I'm and I'm showing you in this map where our survey region is located in Turkey, in the southern borderlands. When I'm discussing the Yalburt inscription in a little bit, I will point out to the Lukalands and the Vianawanda, the ancient city of Vianawanda, which is classical Inuanda. Some of you may know it with that name, its classical name. Please keep in mind that if you draw a straight line from Hattusha to Vianawanda, which is mentioned in the Yalburt inscription, as a bird's fly, you would cross over our survey region and Yalburt, actually. And I'll come back to this point later in my lecture. However, so in my presentation, what I'd like to do is to focus precisely on this question of the Hittite borderlands and what's happening in this survey region. But before I dive into this research question, I'd like to really make the point that archaeology is always a collaborative enterprise by its very nature. And none of the ideas that I share with you today belong solely to me. It's the product of teamwork. I can't emphasize this more. This is why that's why I want to acknowledge the intellectual labor of this core senior team of the project, who runs the work in the field, processes the data, does the intellectual work of interpreting the evidence, and creatively telling the stories from these landscapes where we work. Archaeologists know this really well. But when you're involved in an interdisciplinary project, I've been doing that in the last couple of years, it's sometimes surprisingly very hard to explain this kind of collaborative nature to colleagues from other disciplines like anthropology or geography. Just to give you a sense, Perry Johnson, Müge Durusutandrever, and Ben Marsh and I just completed a lengthy article that we're submitting to the Journal of Eastern Mediterranean Archaeology and Heritage Studies. And we produced this text and its illustrations over the pandemic year. This is a pandemic article. and it took, we recently counted, Müge recently counted that we actually did about 20 hour-long meetings of negotiation and collaboration. So I'd like to point out the sort of really the intensity of this labor. I also would like to acknowledge our financial and institutional supporters here. I'm thankful to the University of Illinois at Chicago, Chicago School of Art and Art History, where I teach, but also the Dean's Office at the College of Architecture, Design, and the Arts for financially and institutionally supporting this, this project. Our project has been funded by grants from the Venner Grant Foundation for Anthropological Research, Humanities Without Walls Consortium, which is funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and Ahmet Suna İnan Kıraç Research Center for Mediterranean Civilizations. I would also like to thank the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism's General Directorate of Cultural Heritage and Museums, who have provided permissions to work, and the government representatives who joined our work. Oftentimes they really work like team members. I'm delighted to report that we just received our permit for a final season of work this summer. And if all goes well, we will be returning to the field in July. My love and greetings go to the resilient and kind people of Ilgan and Kadınhanı, and there are many villages that we've visited. So I offer my special thanks to their generosity for sharing their deep knowledge of their land, of their beloved land and its history, for welcoming us to their villages, their orchards, and offering us fruit from their orchards, and welcoming us to their homes for many meals and breakfasts and so on. They are the main reason we as a team stay attached to and care for these places. So it was in September 1970, the local branch of Rhodes Water Electricity Agency, Yolsu Elektrik, was excavating around the spring near the seasonal pasture settlement of Yalburt Yaylası. In order to tap into the aquifer and distribute Yalburt's ice-cold drinking water to the 3 nearby villages. I appreciate this beginning for our project's storyline with this extractive event, because it turned out that this natural spring would be the site of intersection between modern and ancient infrastructures of water, which is what we study. And in our project, we ended up adopting an explicitly comparative perspective between the two. These workers had to stop their work because they came across a series of cut stone blocks with carved inscriptions on them, which later turned out to be an ancient water monument that interrupted the construction of a modern one. I love this. I'm very proud of this pun. But so this newly discovered water monument turned out to be Yalburt Yaylası's sacred pool monument that featured Hittite great King Tutalio IV's famous commemorative text in hieroglyphic Luwian celebrating his victories over Lucca lands. The director of Ankara Museum, Raji Temizar, was contacted, and he came to Yalburt with a historic team, including the philologist Kemal Balkan, architectural historian Mahmut Akok, archaeologist Burhan Tezcan, and a very young AIA Öztan. For those of you who are not familiar with Anatolian archaeology, these are kind of really legendary figures in the field, who were not so legendary in 1970, I would say. They quickly identified the structure as an imperial Hittite hieroglyphic monument. In fact, the monument of Kurditolo IV, and in the next several years till 1975, they not only excavated and restored the pool, but also opened trenches, test trenches on the Yalburt Mount. So I'm showing you here the really excellent reconstruction drawing of Mahmut Akok on the left, who's very famous with his drawings, and also some images of the reconstruction of the pool, ongoing work on the reconstruction of the pool. So the team also opened a number of test trenches, both on the Yalburt Mound, but also at Kalkamak Ridge on the other side of the road to the east. To their surprise, they were actually looking for a Hittite settlement, but to their surprise, their stratigraphic soundings found a rich late Iron Age, Hellenistic, early and late Roman settlement at the site, but not much else. Perhaps because of this frustration with evidence, the excavation results were never published. And I'm thrilled to report that Yalburt Survey Project is team members are preparing this material for publication for our forthcoming monograph as our legacy data. The pool remained in use for centuries and centuries afterwards, and it was rebuilt in the early Roman period with Hittite blocks at the same site in a smaller scale by using the Hittite blocks as spolia. So turning them upside down in a way. And you can see the Roman rebuilding of the pool using the Hittite blocks on the top left area marked by green. And I wanted to, so here's some more photographs of these really historic moment in archaeological reconstruction, really in 1970s, 72 to 75. And I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that what stands at Yalburt today is actually a fabricated monument. Well, first making a decision to dismantle the Roman pool, right, and to reconstruct a Hittite monument. And the configuration of this Hittite monument was then faithfully based on the epigraphic sequencing of the blocks, which is still debated, and the architectural details, and embedded, unfortunately, in a concrete foundation. And then here's the more recent photograph. And we're working with the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism and the local preservation board in Konya to prepare a long-term architectural conservation and sustainable site management for the site. So the pool's hieroglyphic Luwian inscription features a lengthy commemorative account of Kurditolo IV's military campaigns to the southwest of the Anatolian Peninsula, particularly the Lucca lands. Following the publication of the hieroglyphic Luwian text by Massimo Poeto and David Hawkins, it became apparent that it's one of the longest and most important Luwian inscriptions from the Hittite Empire, comparable only to perhaps the Südburg text in Hattusha. In the inscription, which was distributed over at least 22 blocks, Kurditolo IV speaks in the typical victorious, exalted, and in places violent tone of the great kings, and commemorates his military victories specifically in the Lucca lands. And so I'm showing you some of the some excerpts from this long inscription. And in the inscription, he does talk about sort of really arriving at the frontiers, which is very important for us, and also setting up what he calls a stone stand place, presumably referring to such a commemorative monument similar to the Yalburt monument. He was probably setting these things up in Lisha as well. So this, I want to, and if you actually read through the inscription, you realize you have expressions like the woman and the children knelt down to me, things like that, and a lot of sort of expressions of destruction and so on. And I wanted to sort of really point out this sharp contrast between this kind of serene and ritual setting of the monument on a sacred mountain and this harsh military tone of the inscription. I think that's, to me, that's an important thing. We can talk about this maybe in the question and answer section as well. While Yalburt inscription is extensively studied, this fragmentary but rather important block from Yalburt has been largely overlooked. Studied by Perry Johnson recently, the field director of Yalburt Survey Project. The relief on this block depicts a standing 3/4 size mountain deity embracing the smaller body of Tutalia IV in relief, similar to a relief at the rock-cut sanctuary of Yazılıkaya at the Hittite capital. The mountain deity is identified by the rocky pattern on his kilt and the hieroglyphic Luwian sign for God below his outstretched arm. Similar to the inscription block of Tutalia IV at Emir Gazi that mentions Mount Sarpu, the mountain god embracing Tutalia at Yalburt depicts the anthropomorphized image of the mountain on whose slope the pool is placed. Let's look at the mountain. Yeah, the pool was built on a mountain spring and the slopes of the Karadağ Massif in the pastoral uplands of Ilgan. You can get a sense of the configuration of the site here. I'm showing you the location. In the center is the Hittite Spring Monument. Right above it is the Hellenistic Mount where Raji Temizar and his colleagues have excavated. I have the sort of earliest field notebooks by AIA Öztan in our collection here. The Yalburt pastoral settlement, which is still alive today, and the really large late Roman Byzantine settlement downslope. And the promontory that we have identified, which had a Middle Bronze Age, Late Bronze Age settlement very close to the pool, which was actually had a long history prior to the construction of the pool itself. So as a result of several seasons of fieldwork here, it turns out that Yalburt Yaylası is indeed a very complex site of uninterrupted settlement. This is a map of our sort of work so far at Yalburt, and it witnessed settlement during the Middle and Late Bronze Ages prior to the construction of the Hittite monument. Also housed a prosperous late Iron Age and Hellenistic settlement that focused on a strong textile industry. And finally, a massive 78-hectare pastoral settlement in late antiquity. Which is calling out for those of you who are late antique specialists out there of Anatolia and come and please come and study this settlement. It's, I think, very unique. It has a lot of surface architecture. It's a beautiful pastoral settlement. Let me pose the question here briefly. Why did Tutalia choose to build such an important monument at a remote and seemingly desolate landscape? And I will return to this question at the end of my talk. But is it because of the kind of karstic, evocative nature of this mountain, which was deemed sacred? Was this a site of military stopover to the local lands? Or was this already a powerful place of politics and ritual practice locally? In this talk, what I will try to do is to try to present an answer to you with the help of the results of our survey and landscape archaeology. So Kurditolo, about 20 kilometers as the crow flies, is the site of Kurditolo Yayla, where a limestone block with the hieroglyphic Luwian inscription was discovered in 1884. It's interesting, by Marian Sokolowski, Polish scholar, in the Buvet Mevki, in the northwest village of northwest of the village of Kurditolo, which is under the jurisdiction of Kadınhane today, and associated with a massive earthen dam structure immediately to the east of the find spot. And I'm showing you our map of the area. The inscription has 3 lines and is provisionally dated to the time of Tutalia IV, although it does not name the great king explicitly, but names a local governor whose name is variously read as Shawushka Ruwati or Shawushka Kuruntis, and who is attested in 4 seal impressions in Hattusha Boğazköy. And here's a satellite image just to give you a sense of the enormity of this monument. It's about 1 kilometer long. It's about 900 meters in length, and it's about 20 meters in height from the surrounding landscape. It's really spectacular, and we've published on this monument quite a bit. I'm happy to send you the references. And so the roughly contemporaneous construction of Yalburt Yayla's spring monument and the Kurditolo Yayla earthen dam. Then during the 13th century BCE, great king Tutalia IV has prompted us to hypothesize an imperial intervention in the region by the Hittite state, perhaps through the control and management of water resources and implementation of a water infrastructure. Right. So the monumentalization and ritualization of the springs and construction of water reservoirs that demanded massive labor mobilization clearly demonstrate both symbolic and large-scale political strategies to reconfigure and intensify the agricultural landscape, modify established patterns of land use, and implement a new settlement program. Our concern was, what was the structure of the local landscape in this region that allowed the insertion of these monuments, and how was the settlement system reconfigured? What was the politics? What was this politics of ecology, the politics of the land in this borderland between the longue durée of the local history of the landscape and the imperial interventions of the Hittite state within the territorial, within their territorial framework of the empire? Furthermore, the so-called landscape monuments of the Hittite Empire, which includes rock reliefs, sacred pools, and earthen dams, and I wrote about them in my second monograph, are often studied as isolated monuments in the vast territorial network of the empire, while their local and regional contexts are really rarely studied. We think of these monuments as, okay, so where does it fit in the empire, right? We're less interested in that question. We're more interested in where does it fit in the local landscape, right? In this project, we're concerned to figure out the biography of the diverse local landscapes and understand how did these monuments fit into those stories. And these were some of the core research questions for our survey project. Very cool. Another important historical problem that we wanted to address then had to do with the environmental and vegetation history of the region. This is a fascinating episode of history in central Turkey known as the Beijer occupation phase, a unique period of marked human impact on the environment in the late Holocene that is documented primarily in the lake bottom sediment cores. Lake bottom sediment cores taken from the southwest edge of the Beijer Lake, precisely there in the middle of this photograph, and published in this article by Van Ziest and colleagues. And many other sediment cores have confirmed and roughly aligned with this phenomenon, becoming visible in around 1450 BCE by carbon dating, which corresponds to the beginning of the Hittite Empire period, or the so-called New Kingdom, when Hittites truly became a territorial entity. Paleo-environmental vegetation evidence suggests a remarkable change in the landscape in the form of the cutting of existing deciduous oak parkland and pine woodland, forests, plantation of vineyards or olive orchards, walnut, chestnut, and manna trees, and increased cereal cultivation and increased pasture lands in the region. What is the archaeological correlate of this phenomenon, this very important environmental episode? How does this wave of large-scale human interventionism get entangled in the landscape biographies? That's what we wanted to ask. It's often the case that such climate and vegetation history questions are discussed in macro scale, sweeping global histories and highbrow big data projects of elite institutions, well-funded institutions. But we're not interested in that. We're interested in the implications of such an episode for regional settlement, histories, and transformation of the landscape. So, well, in our survey region, in the archaeological and geomorphic evidence provides stunning testimonials on a very local scale. We're also really in desperate need of more refined micro-environmental work to support our efforts in writing landscape biographies. I'm hoping that this would be a really direction that environmental science and archaeology collaboration can take in the future. As I will try to illustrate in the second half of my talk now, is that our survey confirmed very confidently that in the last centuries of the Hittite Empire, the survey region has a very rich and sophisticated indigenous agro-pastoral life, right, that witnessed an intensified investment by the political elites from Hattusha in the last part of the empire, which is evident in the archaeological record in the form of new foundations like Bozhöyük and Mahmuthisar in the Ilgan Plain, implementation of water installations and irrigation network to improve agricultural production. The construction and maintenance of at least 2 fortresses, Kale Tepesi in the Bulasan River Valley and Uzun Pınar in the Kurugöl Basin, opening of new stone quarries like the Yıldız Tepe quarry that I will talk about in a little bit, and Çaldıal, where we have a Hittite Pitos burial cemetery. In addition to this, we see an appearance of standardized imperial Hittite ceramic assemblages all over the region. I'll come back to these sites shortly. So the Yaldır Survey project comprises a series of hydrologically linked tectonic basins and their surrounding uplands. These tectonic lowland basins are Çavuşçu Lake Basin, the Ilgan Plain, and the Atlanta Plain, which are connected by the river valleys such as the Bulasan River Valley. You can see it in the map. And bracketed by these two uplands in the north, we have the open and dry pastoral uplands of the Gavurda. And in the south, we have the verdant, well-watered, sort of lots of springs, forested uplands of the Bozda. So the survey area is not only interconnected topographically, but it also offers an extensive variety of landscapes to compare, to write different scenarios, different stories of landscape biographies. And these landscapes vary from green forests all the way to the springs that flow from those Bozda uplands into the Ilgan plain. And so so we're trying to, in the monograph that we're producing, we're hoping to present these different kinds of stories associated with these different components of the landscape. Now that you're familiar with the survey area, now I'd like to sort of really take a quick pause here with your permission and to tell you a little bit about our methodology in the field, because I feel that most of our important contributions to the discipline has been in setting up a methodological apparatus that didn't happen over time, that didn't happen overnight, but actually something that we built gradually since 2010. And the first point that I'd like to make is that our work is diachronic, which means that we care about all periods, right? Documenting from anything ranging from our sort of Neolithic caves in the region we have to Ottoman villages, right, at least. So, however, we place emphasis on a comparative work between Holocene and Anthropocene landscapes, Holocene, ancient, contemporary Anthropocene landscapes, in terms of their uses of land, water, and other resources. But also we understand that our fieldwork actually takes place in an Anthropocene landscape. We don't have any kind of romantic understanding of pristine landscapes here, which brings its own challenges, social and environmental injustices with it. And as archaeologists, we feel responsible to address them. Unlike more conventional survey projects that concentrate their efforts looking for more pristine and well-preserved Holocene landscapes. We took up the challenge of the denuded, destroyed, and disposable landscapes of the current late capitalist management of the countryside today to adopt a political ecology as a theoretical and practical aspect of our work. And our practice in the field. We believe, as archaeologists, archaeologists are important stakeholders, especially as advocates for the preservation and thoughtful stewarding of cultural heritage, which is under continued threat vis-a-vis projects of extreme extraction like coal mining, infrastructure projects, stone quarrying, marble quarrying, as well as rampant looting that increases exponentially every day, as we've seen in the last 10 years or so. In the more recent years, we've been interested in questions of climate change, and also, as Anne mentioned in her introduction, and the impact of recent ecological crisis on the livelihood of farmers and rural and urban communities. And as part of our multi-year environmental humanities project, the Albert Project sort of participated in a contemporary art exhibition recently in Chicago's Gallery 400, entitled All Have the Same Breath, which brought the work of field researchers such as archaeologists, anthropologists, geographers, and urban planners in close collaboration with artists, and intended to bring the experience of performing fieldwork in the Anthropocene. What does it mean to perform fieldwork in the Anthropocene? And its politics, right? How do we bring this into the gallery space? And we were represented with Boche Drum's installation, and Boche is a longtime collaborator, researcher, thinker, and an artist, and I've been really, really enjoying working with him over the many, many years. And his work, his installation in Chicago for our project was incredible. And it was entitled We Don't Dig. This is the most pronounced thing that we say in the field when people meet us, because everyone assumes that we're grave diggers, right? And so the Albert Project team members sort of collaborated with Boche in putting this together and explored the experience of being in the field as an archaeologist and how that experience is shaped by participating in or resisting the contemporary regimes of excavation and extraction. If we return to the fieldwork in Ilgan, our survey project aligns with three distinctive movements in survey archaeology. The first one of these is the Mediterranean Aegean style intensive regional survey, which comes with systematic sampling of ceramics and surface finds. In our case, the legacy data involves the excavation materials from 1970s excavations of the Anatolian Civilizations Museum. Secondly, important methodological legacy for our work is the Near Eastern Extensive Survey, in line with the extraordinary work of Tony Wilkinson and others, and requires extra attention to geomorphology and paying attention to non-site features, utilizing remote sensing and GIS. Beyond these traditions rooted in the processual archaeology, we adopted what I would like to call a certain third wave landscape archaeology, for lack of a better term, that has a number of methodological shifts that are not included in conventional survey projects. And those include emphasis on Holocene Anthropocene comparisons, as I mentioned, paying close attention to indigenous knowledge of landscapes, and political ecology as engaged field practice. And also, I want to add sort of an understanding of fieldwork as a site of creativity, paying attention to landscapes of memory, experience, movement, particularly, and sensorial aspects of the landscape. And finally, what I'd like to refer as the archaeology of the medium scale. A major innovation of our project has been this mixed use of both more scientific techniques, such as the use of satellite imagery and GIS, alongside with more intellectually satisfying aspects of the long-term archaeological practice that's about documenting and archiving of material residues in the landscapes, using individually kept field notebooks, hand-drawn site maps and site sketches, narrative video logs, and so on. While many survey projects have abandoned these techniques and went all digital, we believe that they allow us to collect more intimate and embodied knowledge about landscapes and more qualitative than quantitative information, and especially because we pay attention to landscapes as sites of memory and human experience. These techniques are also empowering to individual team members as they are intellectually engaged with the field rather than becoming button-pushing robots. We note our concerns. For project illuminating such techniques because this also silences or erases particular kinds of knowledge about landscapes. As I mentioned earlier in my talk, Perry Johnson, Ben Marsh, Müge Durusu-Tanröver, and I just completed an article where we advocated for the study of medium-scale landscapes, and I want to sort of really explain what I mean by this here. This is an idea that we've been working on in the field. Medium-scale landscapes are landscapes of human experience and the scale of ordinary human action, movement, relationality, and visuality. A farmer walking to his field in the agricultural field, plain, supplicants traveling to a familiar shrine, stone workers bringing blocks from to town from the nearest quarry. Medium scale is what Tim Ingold refers as taskscape, where human labor transforms the landscape within graspable human temporality. This is also the scale in which landscape archaeologists operate in the field. So landscape archaeology often moves back and forth between site-based, more study of urban centers and monuments, and the kind of more macro scale work of ancient environments. But so that the study of medium scale remains rare in Hittite studies, particularly. And landscape biography seems to be a good way to narrate such landscapes. We're also realizing in publishing this article that they require a very special practice of mapping and representing. And so I hope you'll look for our article in the next several months, about a year from now. Now, in the remaining of my time, which is not very much, and I'm wrapping up here, I'd like to turn to the Ilgan Plain to tell you about a key landscape and a series of key sites in the Hittite Empire period. In our survey area, as I promised in the beginning of my talk, and these places allow us to tell a powerful story of the landscape in the Hittite Empire. So the Ilgan Plain is a low, well-irrigated landscape, which can be seen as a vibrant landscape, taskscape, centered on land, fields, and farming. The spatial character of the Ilgan Plain could get rather congested, as a landscape, and where water and wet soil, there's like marshy areas that can get in the way and constrain movement. So just as Hittites were constructing their ritual water monuments up in the Yalburt highlands in the north, and the massive dam over in the Kurditolo lowlands, they're also setting new patterns of management and new infrastructure in the Ilgan Plain. And I want to point out to the site Bosuk that is marked on this map for you. A testimony to this is the existence of this new foundation as kind of a medium-sized new foundation of Bosuk. So Bosuk, the archaeological site of Bosuk, it's a difficult place. It's the city dump. When we visited Ilgan, it's kind of really difficult to work. It's on the southern edge of the Ilgan Plain. Is an example of such a new foundation where the ceramic assemblage closely connects with the production of ceramic workshops of the Hittite capital cities to the northeast and elsewhere. It's a sizable mound built on the banks of one of the major tributaries of the Bulasan River. You'll remember there's that relict waterway that passes by the Bosuk, and so that seems to be very important. And with a most conservative estimate, it's more than a 5 hectare mound, although buried several meters under the several meters of alluvium. But we were able to investigate a small portion of the site in 2011. Since it was being used as a city dump, that kind of really limited our work. So we had to work in the lower slopes. Archaeological fieldwork really requires a lot of innovations, a lot of sort of on-the-spot thinking and adjusting your methodologies. When you can't work on top of the mound, you have to work around it. And so the second millennium ceramic assemblages from the 2010-12 seasons were included as one of the several case studies in Müge Duru Sultan Röber's brilliant dissertation, Experiencing the Hittite Empire in its Borderlands is the title of her dissertation. And Müge points out that the MBA, the Middle Bronze Age local ceramics of Yalbur Survey region aligns quite well with ceramic assemblages of the Middle Bronze Age levels of Beijer Sultan Mound, while during the Late Bronze Age, Yalbur region turns north, right? Turns to explicitly and increasingly towards the north-central Anatolian bears of the Hollis Band, the upper land. So at Bosuk, Müge analyzed a robust assemblage of 900 diagnostic sherds from locus 5, from one locus, one incredible locus, a field to the southwest of the mound. The abundance and coherence of the assemblage suggests us that the field was the site of a single monument, possibly. And having studied the assemblage, Müge suggests a short-lived, single-period, prosperous settlement of the late Hittite Empire, most likely a new foundation that corresponds to Talia the Fourth's project, right? And recently plowed field that allowed us to collect this many sherds. And Müge suggests that the distribution of the vessels between multi-purpose vessels, consumption and food preparation is even, although the absence of a storage vessels is striking, as Müge points out, and the consumption vessels lean towards communal eating practices, especially including anti-splash rim bowls, which constitute a large part of the assemblage. in Hattusha and Boshuk, and very possibly linked with events of communal consumption. So they're eating. Boshuk is an important site for us in connecting the Ilgan Plain to Hattusha's political intervention into this borderland region. If we follow the Bulasan River at a very important crossing, or the narrows that leads from the Ilgan Plain to the Bulasan River Valley that connects the Ilgan Plain to Atlanta, we find a major well-preserved fortress of Kaletepesi that you see in the middle of this map. This outcrop, as you can see, divides the valley from the rolling hills that extend eastwards to Kurditolo. You can see the location of the dam there. It's not very far from Kaletepesi. And beyond to Kurditolo. So Kaletepesi is an archaeological site featuring a well-preserved fortress of massive ashlar blocks in the northern slopes of this dolomitic limestone outcrop overlooking the Bulasan Valley. It is the key site for early Hittite imperial footprint in the region, featuring an impressively built fortress and a series of monumentalized water management structures. The fortress was built where the slope is steep, and preserved walls of a lower fortified area extend to enclose one of the most copious springs in the area. So just below this enormous wall, we have a major natural spring there that the locals continue to visit. It's one of the most prolific springs in all of Ilgan, really. Although the fortress and its extensive archaeological remains had not been the subject of any in-depth fieldwork, the association of fortress with the Hellenistic and Roman city of Tyrion by early travelers confused people and had actually dated this ashlar masonry to the Hellenistic period. You know, if you see any kind of nice masonry, you say, oh, it must be Hellenistic. Well, actually, no. So our study of the architectural technologies used in the construction of the fortress, the discovery of the quarry that supplied its stones demonstrate a pre-Iron Age date for masonry. The fortress was built with massive ashlar blocks of marl, and the best preserved northeastern facade of the fortress, 8 to 9 blocks, courses of blocks. The height of each course varies between 60 to 85 centimeters with increasing dimensions towards the top. And I want to mention really, I want to remember Martin Bachmann for discussing this masonry with me, and I want to thank Jürgen Zehr also, sort of really contemplating this masonry with me, who are experts in both sort of Hittite and Hellenistic stone masonry. So the horizontal extent of some of these blocks actually go all the way to about 2 meters. The central and the ashlar blocks do not represent evidence for the use of chisels or mortar. Blocks are fitted together with this kind of really cushion-like bonding techniques that are very similar to the monument in Yalburt as well. The central rectangular space of the fortress is further strengthened by additional towers visible on the southwestern side and in the cascading sides of the tower. So you can see these kind of 2 lines of towers cascading down and enclosing the spring in the middle of it, right? And so systematic field walking on the lower slopes of Kaletepesi not only suggests that we were engaging here in an urban scale settlement extending to an expansive lower town, at least 300 meters beyond the fortifications. Here's a general layout of the settlement on top with an aerial view in the bottom. And this is our survey. These are kind of really our locuses where we collected the late Bronze Age sherds that are marked here as well. So these collections provide a reliable assemblage of late Bronze Age ceramics associated with the settlement, dating the foundation of the fortress to the 16th to 15th centuries BCE. Likewise, the architectural technologies used in the construction of the fortress and the dating of the quarry, Yıldız Tepe, which supplied the fortress, marks the confirmed this Hittite for this late Bronze Age date for the masonry. So Ben Marsh, the project's geomorphologist and geographer, and really great professor to work with in the field, has observed that the blocks were not quarried from the dolomitic limestone bedrock of Kalitepesi outcrop, but were brought probably from a quarry that offered a better quality and softer building blocks of marl. So in 2011 and 2012 seasons, Yalbert Survey Project identified and documented the Yıldız Tepe marl quarry on a ridge connected by a saddle to Kalitepesi outcrop, only about 1.2 kilometers to the southeast of the fortress. The site constitutes the only marl outcrop in the vicinity of the fortress, and in the survey of the Yıldız Tepe quarry, we identified drill holes, like you see in the bottom right, on the north and northwest edges of the outcrop, a dense scatter of non-local gabbro hammer fragments. I'm gonna show you our plan of we measured the site, and we used this drawing in our exhibition as well. I'm pretty proud of this this drawing of the quarry itself. We're hoping to publish it very soon. And we found a dense scatter of non-local green gabbro hammer fragments and chips that were used as quarrying tools documented across the quarry. With the additional absence of any extensive evidence of Iron Age tools, iron tools, the quarry must have been used in the Bronze Age and must have provided the marl blocks to the Kalitepesi. We actually have a number of dropped blocks between Yıldız Tepe and Kalitepesi as well. So it's pretty convincing that this is the source of the site. And also, and I finally want to very briefly take you to the site just in the very crucial settlement of Bağlar Mevki, on the northern lower slopes of the Yıldız Tepe quarry. So that right down below, about 150 meters from this quarry, we have the site of Bağlar Mevki that we sort of really miraculously came upon. The ceramics extend over barren rock, gully, and adjacent field in an undatable fossil spring. In a landscape which is desiccated today. So there was a spring around here. In addition to the ceramics, the site was covered also with the gabbro flakes that I showed you earlier of the mason's hammers. Intensive field walking at the site produced a representative sample of ceramics, and dating of this assemblage suggests a date a couple of centuries before the construction of the Kurditolo embankment, and parallel to the dates we have for the fortress. So according to Müge's work, ceramic assemblage of Bağlar Mevki can be best understood compared to the assemblage of Bozhuyuk in this new foundation in the Ilgan Plain I talked about. The assemblage speaks to both local production and imports from central Anatolia, with some central Anatolian forms appearing that were not encountered even in the tremendously rich corpus of Bozhuyuk. In terms of dating, the Bağlar Mevki assemblage securely stands in the late Bronze Age. Tentatively, we can conclude that the settlement was in existence for only a short while in the early late Bronze Age and a couple of centuries before the construction of Kurditolo Dam. And perhaps this was the settlement, and this is kind of really my wild dream idea, is that this was the settlement where the stonemasons who worked in the Yıldız Tepe quarry lived. In conclusion, I'm about to be finished. Thank you so much for your patience. In conclusion, I will only raise a few points. First and foremost, the strong material culture links that we were able to establish in the landscapes of Ilgan and Kadınhane is really important in the way that we can for example, connects the stories of Kale Tepesi, Yıldız Tepe, Bağlar Mevki, which clearly belong to the same taskscape in the landscape. It's not too far-fetched to say that the construction of Kurditolo Dam in Kadınhane lowlands is intimately linked to the new foundations in the Ilgan Plain, such as Bozhöyük. This is kind of really unexpected for us, but very, very important. Bozhöyük, where Hittite elites were eating communally in dishes served in style and fashion of the capital in Hattusha. The ritual monument of Yalburt, then, if we go back to it, must have been designed not only to celebrate these new spectacles of empire that's happening in the lowlands, borderlands, but also to commemorate the Hittite army's successes in the Luka lands or Lisha. My second point is that if we are concerned, when we're concerned about today, very much in questions of social justice, right? The study of medium-scale landscapes that we're advocating in our new article allows us to approach more equitable histories, more equitable historicizing of landscapes. When you're, as a landscape historian or as a landscape archaeologist, you don't have to get carried away with arguments that prioritize imperialist viewpoints, right? But instead, and so really to stop the authority of the archive that comes from the Hittite center, right? But instead to mobilize archaeology, archaeological evidence, this forensic evidence to radically historicize these imperial interventions within local and regional histories and think about the resistance, think about and fold them into local and regional histories. In the Yalburt Project study area, we've been trying to do this. We've tried to demonstrate that urban sites and monumental structures such as Kale Tepesi Fortress actually existed long before the 13th century ambitious project of Tutalio IV. And seems to have continued its role even after the collapse of the Hittite Empire. So these landscapes are not bound to empires. They exist before them, they exist after them. These symbolic landscapes, they exist before the empire comes, they continue to exist within the local communities, within the local practices. Empires just really blind us with their impressive authoritarian archives. They think they create everything, but they're kind of really very temporary side effects to large, very long-term landscape histories. That has something that I've tried to argue in this paper. Thank you so much for your patience, and I welcome any questions, comments from the audience. I'll stop my sharing my screen.
Thank you very much. I invite members of the audience to put your questions or comments in the Q&A tab, and in the meantime, there are some questions. The first is, has anything been done on luminosity dating on the stones in the quarry?
No, we haven't done that. That would be a really excellent, that would be an excellent thing to do, particularly in terms of the dating. I would imagine that would be the sort of task of another project after us. We have actually, Muge's work has been really fundamental in actually using the ceramic sequencing of that dating for the sites and the way that different sites are actually connected. So I just want to sort of really make the point that it just takes so much labor, right? And so much labor in putting together an assemblage in a survey region where there are no sort of comparable stratigraphic sequences that are offered to us, right? And so we have to go to Beijer Sultan, we have to go to Hattusha. These are very far places. We don't have any excavations that offers us actually a study material. So we had to build our own assemblage. We had to build our own ceramic sequencing. And I really respect that the amount of labor that's involved for each period, right? And so, so before we jump into sort of some further scientific techniques, and of course, it's really important to kind of really supplement these ideas. But if you were there in the landscape, if you were there, if you walk from Kalitepesi to Yıldız Tepe, we walked actually the entire sort of outcrop along the Bulasan Valley. We walked the entire thing, so we checked every single quarry. There are several other quarries. This is the only marl quarry that is available, actually, that has any evidence of work. And so we're pretty confident that this is the quarry that was used by the Kalitepesi builders. Thank you so much for that question.
Thank you. The next question is, are any names known in Hittite or Luwian for the sites?
For the sites that well, this is one thing that we've never been really so curious about, right? Because this is the argument that I'm proposing. There's a lot of interesting work being done in trying to identify particular sites with particular historically named places in Hittite texts, right? I respect that work, but I find it a little fraught to actually really keep that as a goal of our research project. Our research project wasn't interested in that at all. We're not really into identifying places. We've been interested in understanding the landscape more accurately. And I've actually published a number of articles on this sort of question of the authority of the archive and how textual evidence is kind of really imposed upon archaeologists and archaeology doing fieldwork as like, you should look at these texts and sort of see if they're correct, see if they're, this is the kind of really old history, old colonial history of archaeology in the Middle East, right? All these classically trained sort of archaeologists, diplomats, enthusiasts went to the Middle East to prove that the biblical place names were correct. It goes back to that colonial history. We don't want to replicate that. So there's no really, we didn't find any tablets. Maybe if we found some tablets, we would know the place names. If you don't have any tablets, we haven't been interested in the speculative practice of trying to guess what site is which place mentioned in the text. What really matters to us is really to understand this kind of politics of the landscape and how that politics plays out in the material culture, in the material sort of in the material landscape within this geography. Thank you so much for asking that question, because it just really brings me to talk about really that's a very strong aspect of Hittite sort of Hittite landscape studies in our field, and really radical, really important work has been done, particularly fruitful when archaeologists are actually collaborating with ancient historians who are very well-versed in ancient texts. And I can't emphasize how important that kind of collaboration is. But we need to be careful not to impose the authority of the archive on the archive of the archaeological evidence. I hope that is a clear point that I've tried to make in this work. We need to honor, I want to refer to Laurent Olivier's book, Archaeology Archaeology as Memory, and the Abyss of Time. I can't remember the exact title of the book. It's a brilliant argument which actually argues how archaeology has been so much imprisoned by this kind of historical interpretation, and how archaeology is actually a discipline of memory, and that's how where its strength is. So we're doing landscape archaeology here. We're not doing ancient history. So I'm so sorry not to identify any place names for you.
Thank you. The next question, I guess you will probably answer similarly, is can the activity in this region be linked to a way to try to stop the famine mentioned in the Hittite documents?
That's a really wonderful question. And that's something that I should think about. Yes, I think the project here, Totalia's project has been implemented, if we're accurate with dating this, with the Yalbert Monument, with Kurditolo Monument, and the sort of agricultural sort of rehabilitation project in this region, in this borderland region, actually corresponds to a moment of crisis. And that this is actually a few decades before the collapse of the Hittite Empire that we're talking about, and so there's certainly a kind of a sense of urgency in the kind of really intensity of this project. So in our articles, we kind of really talked about the Kurditolo Dam, for example. If you think about the labor that's actually put into building a kind of a dam that's 20 meters high and a kilometer long, you must be really trying to do something. But it turns out that they built the dam in the wrong place. They built it on a sinkhole. And it was in the end, this dam was actually never used. So we did some coring in the reservoir of the supposed reservoir of the dam, and they figured out that there was actually no this dam was actually never used, never held water. This is Ben really thinks as some kind of very performative work on the behalf of the Hittite Empire to build a dam that's in the end was not very useful, right? And so and it's a typical example of a labor that's kind of really put in, impressive amount of labor that's put in at a time of panic. And so late Bronze Age, I always talk about this in my talk, in my classes, when I talk about the end of the late Bronze Age and the collapse in the Eastern Mediterranean world. It's actually very similar to our current situation when you have all these migrants sort of crossing the Mediterranean, right? The so-called sea peoples, and sort of trying to find jobs and food and place to sustain their lives, right? And so in antiquity, it was Egypt. They were trying to go to Egypt. Today, it's Europe, and all these people sort of really drowning in the waters of the Mediterranean. And so I compare a lot sort of our current moment of sort of immigration and migrancy to what was happening in the late Bronze Age, and sort of could compare that famine to the pandemic today. So similar kinds of crises and the pandemic has been connected to climate change as well. So I hope that answers your question. But thank you so much. Actually, I should work on this sort of the question of the famine that's discussed in the Hittite text, which I believe is connected to the sort of ecological crisis that they were experiencing at the end of the empire. So thank you.
Thanks. The next question is, thank you for the talk. You got my brain running. Do you know, or can you estimate the geographical distance between the regular residents of the people collecting taxes and the dwellings of those who worked the surrounding land? Can you guess how often they might encounter each other directly?
Thank you. Thank you. That's again sort of tax collecting is not a very archaeological question. So it's just kind of really our research project is very archaeologically oriented. And so my understanding is that this was if you look at the Hittite text, this region is actually a little notorious for the Hittite kings, right? It's a troublemaking region. It's supposed to be governed by a community of elders. It kept its autonomy in general. So Hittites have been kind of really a little pedasa, Hittites have been a little frustrated with this region. And I guess it's one of the sort of really reasons why Tutalia IV was really intervening into this period. So I actually see Pedasa, if you want to think about the scale of Pedasa, right? And so Pedasa is rather a regional sort of political entity with kind of a more internal taxation, probably. And so if we think of the Kale Tepesi as a fortress that is controlling this kind of really both the Ilgan Plain and the Bulasan River Valley, right? These are the two powerful sort of agricultural landscapes within this region. So I'm imagining, the guy who's collecting the taxes are sitting here in this picture, right? And so there's another fortress, Uzunpınar, that I didn't talk about, and that's in the Çavuşçu Lake Basin. And on the other side of our survey area, on the other side of Yalburt Yaylası, and we have another Hittite fortress there where we hope to work this summer with more extensive documentation. So we were going to work in two sites, both in Kale Tepesi and in Uzunpınar, these kind of large urban settlements. And Uzunpınar is another 70-hectare site during the Hittite period. And so so we're interested in sort of how, in terms of, so I would say these tax collectors are actually just pretty close to where these people actually live. How that changes in the last phase of the Hittite Empire is a little unknown. Maybe with the establishment of Bozhöyük, right, in the Ilgan Plain, which clearly was a Hittite imperial administrative new foundation. I imagine that with the establishment of Bozhöyük, the new foundation of Bozhöyük at the time of Tutalia, then probably changed the picture, changed the local dynamics of the local economy, right? And so, and remember, Ilgan Plain is a very important place militarily. And so you want to remember, Atatürk had a major maneuver in the Ilgan Plain. Kanuni Sultan Süleyman had a major maneuver in the Ilgan Plain. Xenophon talks about the Ilgan Plain, as a mercenary soldier and maneuvering in the Ilgan Plain. So there is a really interesting sort of location to think about in a trans-historical way. And that's kind of really what we're writing about. What is the story in terms of this management of this landscape? And I feel like Uzunpınar and Kale Tepesi are key sites which controlled the agricultural production in this region prior to the sort of imperial intervention. And I think it shifted to Bozhöyük. So thank you so much for that question. That really made me think more about the sort of really daily experience of living in this landscape. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Next question is, thank you for the fascinating lecture. As the term Anthropocene has entered the academic discourse in the humanities and subsequently in archaeology, how do you assess the potential contributions from archaeology in the interdisciplinary research on human impact on the environment, not only in the longue durée, but also for future human landscapes? I am interested in your particular observations and conclusions within your project. I'd also like to thank you for proposing a new discourse on a third wave landscape archaeology. it's very much overdue and needed.
Thank you so much. That's a very generous and very kind and thought-provoking comment. I'm really very, very grateful. Yes, Anthropocene, that's the reason actually I wanted to sort of, when I moved to UIC, when I moved to Chicago, I was interested in questions of social justice and climate justice, and I wanted to engage with this as an archaeologist, right? As an archaeologist who do field work, and I've really and there's a really fantastic community of scholars here from different disciplines thinking about climate change, and I do feel that archaeologists have a lot to contribute. They have a lot to contribute. First of all, I think the first thing that really comes to my mind that's very, very striking is the nature of our work in the field. You know, if I've heard a really fantastic lecture by Michael Hart, and you will just remember Michael Hart with Michael Hardin, as in Michael Hardin, Antonio Negri, the authors of Empire, right? And so Michael Hart was talking about in his talk that he gave at University of Chicago, where he was saying the theory today that's going to help us is going to come from the field. And what he meant by that, he was actually talking about social movements and the idea of, you know, Occupy Wall Street, Arab Spring, Gezi movement in Turkey, Black Lives Matter, right? So the theory, the crisis of theory in academia is going to be resolved if we turn to these social movements. But I also kind of really expanded that a little bit and thought about also field as in field work as a way of engaging with the world. And so archaeologists' engagement with landscapes, archaeologists' engagement with the field, and doing this in a collaborative way, doing this in a way that is, you know, the work with environmental scientists, the work with ancient historians, the work with sort of these different disciplines that is so common and well known and practiced really well. And the way, and archaeologists actually have a lot of clout in terms of when you do field work, your expertise has a lot of power as a stakeholder. That's what I want to say. You're very actually in a position of power, and we can use our position of power for advocacy for climate justice, advocacy for social justice, and advocacy for really preservation of cultural heritage as well. And so Anthropocene Debate, if you look at one of the really important books that are produced recently about the Anthropocene, is Anna Singh and a whole bunch of authors. It's called The Arts of Living in a Damaged Planet. If you look at that, the beginning of that book talks about landscapes and talks about haunted landscapes and the residues in the landscapes, right? Who else studies, who else other than archaeologists study landscapes and the haunting, you know, this idea of haunted landscapes and this idea of learning from the material residues of landscapes in which there are these residues that come back to us and haunt us and revisit us. And so I feel that this archaeological methods going all the way back to sort of really beginning of the discipline, its collaborations with geologists and environmental scientists, and also this kind of very poetic and creative way of thinking about the world in its deep time, especially with the concept of deep time. Archaeologists have a lot to offer, both in terms of thinkers of landscape history, but also in terms of as activists in the field, right? As academics who want to sort of really dedicate their work to social justice in that sense. So that's why I kind of really got involved with questions of climate change, because we also, as archaeologists, we also need to make our work relevant local communities. We need to make ourselves relevant to the contemporary problems of the world. And we need to be engaged. Archaeologists were in the field in 1970s as scientists. They just wanted to do their work and get the hell out of there. In 2020, 2021, we can't do that. We're there. If we're doing our work, we need to give back. When we're actually doing our research, we're working in lands that do not belong to us. And we need to respect and collaborate with and work for the local communities. That's what I think in this point. And so this kind of decolonized aspect of archaeology can be tremendously impactful in Anthropocene discussions. Thank you so much for asking that question.
Thank you. We only have a few more minutes in what we had scheduled for the question and answer period, but we have several more questions, some of them quite complex, but I've been going through them in order that they came in. So we'll continue as long as you're willing to.
I'm happy to stay, but I also I also want to sort of really I'm happy to continue to stay, Chuck, as long as you would like to stay. But I also want to sort of really respect everyone's time in this kind of beautiful, beautiful spring day. Go ahead, yes.
Are there any thoughts to doing geomagnetics on the plane?
Yeah, I mean, this summer's work, we have a Venner grant from the Venner Grant Foundation, specifically to do geophysics, particularly in two sites, Kale-Tepesi as well as the Uzun Pınar, those two large sort of late Bronze Age settlements. We're planning to do geophysics as well as some drone mapping, sort of 3D modeling of these sites, just as a kind of really our final gesture to document these two major sites, in the hopes that in the future archaeologists would be interested to come and sort of do some excavation projects maybe and push our work further. Our survey project is not a project that is, a lot of survey projects these days, and particularly in Turkey, is just like a prelude to an excavation. Ours is not. We're not interested in excavating any places. We're interested in landscape archaeology, and we'll probably move to another region. But it has been enormously important for me to really engage with Ilgın and Kadınhane. It's a really fantastic place to work. So yeah, and it's I just want to put a call out there. Those of you who are interested in applying different methodologies to this landscape, archaeologists should feel welcome to come and go and work there. So thank you.
Thanks. Let's do one more question. Thank you for your wonderful lecture. When you deal with resistance and imperial intervention, can you identify local versus transferred populations in this survey area?
Local versus transferred. Did I
Yes.
understand that correctly? Okay. Yeah, great question. Wonderful question, but I don't think I have the ability to answer. First, the question actually makes an assumption that there are transferred communities that are sort of forced. I'm guessing that this our colleague or our student is implying that there is a resettled sort of deported community. I'm not aware of that, but and I haven't really assumed such a thing. Of course, empires do these things a lot, and this kind of what I would call social injustice is very, very common. But in the scale of the material work that that landscape archaeology can do, and those questions are really difficult to answer. Again, we've been after more archaeological questions than sort of really textual questions. So that's a yeah. I'm not really answering your question, but the idea is that I was going to say something else, but idea again is really, I mean, these questions methodologically, the question of deported populations, right? The deported communities. That's actually a very difficult thing to study when you limit yourself into one place. For example, like a strontium analysis, for example, it would be with animal bones. I mean, it's probably would be the way to go. That's not something, in the absence of any excavations, that's actually something very difficult to study with the methods that we've been studying this landscape. So, but that would be an excellent research question. But I would imagine that it would have to be a multi-sited, multi-regional sort of study. You can't really do that by working in a small local region. So thank you for that question.
Thanks. There are many more questions, and I fear we just don't have the time to do it. So I'd like to thank you once again for your fascinating lecture, and perhaps Anne also would like to come in and
yeah, just thank you so much for this really, really, really interesting lecture. I just opened up all sorts of new ways of thinking about my project in Cilicia as well. It really was a marvelous lecture. And I'd also like to thank the audience for joining us on this wonderful spring day. We really appreciate your participation. And as Chuck said, there were oodles of questions for you. We would have been here another hour, I think, if we'd have been able to address all the questions. So thanks. I would like to thank the audience for their wonderful questions as well. Thanks so much, Omur, and good luck on your project this summer. And we look forward to hearing more about it.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank you again for inviting me. And also just to say to the audience, thank you so much for staying and just really listening. Please feel free to, I'm Googleable, just Google me, and my email is my first name @uic.edu. Feel free to send me your questions. I'm happy to engage and get to know you and answer your questions. So thank you, everyone.
And thanks also to Mark once again. We appreciate your invaluable technological assistance here.
Thank you,
Bye,
Mark.
everybody.
Bye. Bye.